Hello, this is another video lecture that looks at the story of Native Americans in westward expansion and manifest destiny. And this is actually the last lecture video series that looks at this particular series of Native American experience. And this is the end of Native American resistance. As we learned in our previous video lecture, some of the Native Americans on the Great Plains, groups like the Dakota or the Sioux, greatly resisted and even won major battles like the Battle of Little Bighorn. But despite that victory, why did then the Native Americans not succeed in stopping westward migration from the American settlers? How did resistance end in effect? How did we go from this photograph here of a Native American in full cultural dress, eagle headdress feathers, and teepee, to being almost assimilated in a sense to adopting American traditions and culture? This video lecture series is going to look primarily at that end of that resistance. How did we get to the end of the tensions on the Great Plains? The reading for this particular lecture comes from Chapter 18, Section 2, pages 593 to 598. It's the title, Wars for the West. Our guiding questions is: how did the destruction of the buffalo make Native Americans dependent on U.S. government help? What was the Dawes Act and why didn't it work? How did the massacre at Wounded Knee mark the end of Native American resistance? So let's look here at some of those aspects of the end of westward expansion for Native Americans. One of the videos we watched in class was the destruction of the buffalo. Remember, as we discussed earlier, the buffalo were essential to the livelihood of the Native Americans living on the Great Plains. It was everything: their food, their clothing, their shelter. It was even the center of their religious beliefs. So with the destruction of the buffalo is going to lead to a major decision that Native American tribes living on the Great Plains are going to have to basically do. Between this period of time period in the westward expansion, between 1850 and 1890, in roughly that time period, millions of bison were killed. Ranchers who were worried about the buffalo carrying diseases that would maybe impact their herd, miners, there were even just bounty hunters, people who came out onto the Great Plains to kill the buffalo for just basically for their hides. The hides could be turned into leather belts that were kind of needed for the factories back out in the East Coast. So millions of bison were killed during this time period in the second part of westward expansion. Now, if you think about it, remember the buffalo was everything: food, clothing, shelter. So if the food source is gone, if your shelter's gone, if your tools that you're needing to survive are all gone, what do? Do you starve to death? And that's the decision that a lot of Native American tribes were kind of left with. This is why many of them will end up onto the reservation, because at least if they promised, if they go onto the reservation, that the U.S. government said, well, we'll give you supplies, we'll give you resources. And so for many of the tribes living on the Great Plains, it seemed like that was their only way of survival. If they agreed to move to the reservations, then at least their tribes would survive. Living on the Great Plains, where there's no more buffalo anymore, it means death. And so for most of the Native Americans, that was the kind of the decision they had: keep fighting, but probably die of starvation, or give up and move on to the reservation, and hopefully to keep your tribe alive and keep passing down those culture to that next generation. You know, before Europeans arrived, it was believed about 25 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains, all the way from really Mexico through the Texas, all the way up through this part of the country, all the way up through Canada. By the end of westward expansion, it was believed that only a few hundred maybe existed. Today, buffalo have actually come back a little bit through some conservation efforts by our part. It's now estimated that around 30,000 buffalo live in the wild, but mostly in isolated places, like national parks like the Black Hills National Park and the Yellowstone National Park. So the buffalo had a huge impact, not only for the livelihood of the Native Americans, but once it was gone, they didn't have much of a choice: reservation life or death on the plains. Another aspect of the Native Americans' end of resistance is a kind of a way ending of their cultural life as being nomadic. And this was something called the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act is a law passed in 1887 that basically tried to encourage Native Americans to give up their traditional ways and become farmers. An American officer named Captain Richard Pratt was famously said once to kill the Indian and save the man. the idea was that the livelihood of Native Americans is gone. The buffalo are gone. The living nomadic lifestyles are gone. The only way to save this group of people is to assimilate, bring them into the United States culture by ending their culture, ending their old traditions and old practices. And that's what the Dawes Act tried to do. It created farm plots for families, for them to move on. It was like almost in a sense a homestead act for Native Americans, even though traditionally it was their land anyway. But it was something that would give them specific plots of land. This was hard for Native Americans because they didn't have the same concept of land ownership as Americans and Europeans did. They didn't view land as something that you owned. It was something you lived on and shared with everything in nature. And so this idea of owning a piece of property was very foreign to them, and it didn't work very well. Another way that they killed the Indian, in a sense, was by re-education of the children. Lots of special schools were established back on the East Coast where children were sent to with the whole purpose of trying to teach them American traditions and culture and language in the hopes of giving them those skill sets that they could use going back to the Great Plains and help their tribes make that transition from their traditional old ways to the new lifestyle that they would have to live under this American system. This is another video clip you see here of an Indian day school, again shot by Thomas Edison, and you can see these little children being kind of brought out in front of the camera. They're all wearing clothing styles of the Americans of the time period, the little prairie dresses, the little pants and cotton shirts. They're definitely not dressed as Native Americans. They're dressed as little American children, and that really was what the purpose of these schools were. Even if it meant beating the children, threatening them if they spoke their native language, practicing the religious belief. Again, the mentality, and it was intended to be a good thing, but it really tried to, in a sense, destroy their culture. The only way to save them is by killing their culture, and that was kind of what the Dawes Act tried to do. Obviously, for a lot of Native Americans, they didn't want anything to do with it. Their culture was their culture. Their stories, their traditions, their livelihood had been passed down generation to generation, and they were not willing to just give that up for the sake of giving it up. And so many Native Americans refused to be a part of this. Some farmers, again, not understanding the idea of land ownership, sold their land to a lot of very shady characters, I guess it would be a good way of putting it, for their land for a lot less than it was worth. It really ended up really hurting many of the Native Americans in the process. So it was intended to be beneficial, but the Dawes Act really, in a sense, ended up being really a failure. The final end of resistance is going to occur at an event known as the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. In class, we watched a couple videos about this particular massacre. A couple key highlights to remember about this particular event. In the 1890s, for a lot of Native Americans living on the Great Plains, especially for the Lakota or the Sioux, it seemed as if their world was coming completely unraveled and coming to an end. It was almost like an Armageddon story, this idea that their world is ending. And a new religious revival was beginning to form in a lot of these reservations called the Ghost Dance. And for a lot of these Ghost Dance practitioners, people who believed in this idea that by praying and worshiping in a certain way, they could bring about the end of Western settlement on the Great Plains and restore life back to how their ancestors had lived, bring the buffalo back, and drive out all the white settlers. In 1890, hearing reports that some of the leaders were nearby a nearby reservation near a place called Wounded Knee, the U.S. military was sent in to arrest the leaders and to make sure they had no arms. For a lot of the soldiers and the military, they always were worried about Native American rebellions and resistance in some of these reservations. And we don't know exactly what happened. Most likely a shot was fired accidentally as the soldiers were probably trying to pick up rifles from some of the tribe members, and the army thought they were being attacked, and they opened fire. And it was a massacre. 300 men and women and children were killed by this attack, and just wiped out this whole village. The Wounded Knee Massacre is seen as kind of the bookend of Native American resistance. After this particular incident, there will be really no other major conflicts on the reservations, really for almost another 100 years, not until the 1970s. where Native American activists will again push for better equality and equal rights and challenge federal authority on these Native American lands. So the end of this resistance really ends here at the Wounded Knee Massacre. It's manifest destiny. You can't stop it, and neither can I. Throughout this period of westward expansion, we've talked about how we gained all this territory that will become the United States of America, the 48 states from East Coast to West Coast, from sea to shining sea. A lot of groups are going to benefit from this expansion. My ancestors, our city here of Omaha, where we live in, and many, many other places will benefit, and groups of people will benefit from this westward expansion. Some groups aren't going to benefit, and their story is the Native Americans. Their story is rather more of a tragic aspect of this particular events. I hope you've enjoyed listening to these lectures. I hope this has helped you kind of remember some of the main ideas, main thoughts you should know about westward expansion. As always, if you have questions or concerns, please make sure you talk with Mr. Mosier. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.